Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners, welcome to Inside the Tent, our series where we go behind the microphone of our hit podcasts, old and new. I'm Josh Dean, one of the co-founders of Campside Media, and a guy you might recognize as the host of some of our shows. But today I'm talking about one I just worked on as a producer. It's called Dr. Dante, hosted by the great Sam Mullins, who you might also remember from one of our most famous podcasts, Chameleon Wild Boys. Almost as soon as Sam finished that, I asked him if he wanted to work on another season of Chameleon, Dr. Dante, a very different show that still felt like a thing Sam would be great for. The story of this incredibly prolific serial con artist is almost impossible to believe. So if you haven't listened, you should. And if you have, but always wanted to hear a bit more from Sam about making it, just sit back and enjoy. And for more conversations like this, don't forget to sign up at joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Now here's Sam Mullins. So, Dr. Dante, very different project than Wild Boys, obviously, which was the first show you made for us, and one in which it literally came from your life, from your hometown, was your entry into podcasting, and was an extremely personal story. This is the opposite of a very personal story. But I remember when we thought of you for this, it was because I think you told me that you were, if not participant in some kind of touring circus, you at least had friends who were in the circus. Is that right?
Well, for most of my 20s, I would do these fringe festivals, the fringe festival circuit. They're all kind of modeled after the Edinburgh Fringe, where you have clown acts, magicians, circus performers, comedians. You have everything. I was like a storytelling performer. Like I would do autobiographical stories. And you know, every city you go to, you're just drinking with a bunch of creative types from all over the world with completely different skill sets. And when you were first telling me about the sort of seedy hypnosis scene that this guy came from, I was like, oh yeah, I know people like that. I know some really crooked magicians and really sketchy characters from doing these theater festivals for years. So, and also, one of the first things I noticed when I was learning about Dr. Dante is that he's a bit of a social climber. And I'm definitely always fascinated by people like that too, and have been in those people's orbit before. So yeah, it made sense to me that you thought of me.
Had you ever actually known a hypnotist?
Oh yeah. I feel like there's lots of mentalists, which is not the same, but I've definitely seen a magic show on the Fringe where an audience member has been hypnotized in the traditional sense. Yeah.
Have you been hypnotized?
No, but I don't know if this is a common thing, but my high school class, when we graduated, we have this like huge party where we book entertainment acts, and we had a hypnotist come, and they do the thing where they get 12 volunteers on stage, and then they dim the lights and they put them under. But also inevitably people in the audience will accidentally get hypnotized, and he'll have to bring those people on stage too. But I remember when he was inducing everybody, I was like, I need to really think about something else because I don't want to do this. I have never like tried to allow myself to be hypnotized. I've done the opposite. But I've seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a generally skeptic about almost everything, and so I'm still not sure if I believe in hypnosis. I mean, I know many people who swear by it and say that it's happened to them, and it seems to mostly be considered credible. I mean, did you have a feeling about how valid or invalid it is as a...
Well, like, you mean in terms of whether people can really be hypnotized?
Yeah, or whether they're just wanting to be hypnotized. It's like power of suggestion, and that's a fine line. Like, power of suggestion is what hypnosis is. Like, people are telling you to be asleep and you fall asleep. Are you actually asleep? I don't even know what I'm asking here. Yeah. I don't know what I believe and even what it means to be hypnotized.
Well, let me put it this way. That I was very skeptical of it too. And I'm like, what does this mean? That you can control someone, they can do whatever you want? And how do you know that when you bring them out, that they're out for good? The thing that made me a believer in this is real is the 2 times that I've seen a professional hypnotist put people under, someone sitting near me who I know was accidentally hypnotized. And both cases, it was the last person that would willingly go under and volunteer for a hypnosis shows. And then they go on stage and, pretend you're a child, pretend you're a chicken, things like that. And both times I saw someone who would never be doing that on stage doing it.
And so Dante was obviously the story of we call him a con artist. He is a con artist, but also seemingly a legitimate hypnotist who then became a con artist. He wasn't faking being a hypnotist, is I guess what I'm asking.
He was a real hypnotist, and he's really good. And another thing that I've learned about putting people under hypnosis is it is relatively easy. It's not a difficult thing to learn. And I think he had a natural aptitude for being good at it. Like, he's someone who is very comfortable herding the sheep on stage, and he had a fantastic voice. I've learned that the quality of voice leading you through hypnosis does matter, and he had an excellent broadcaster's voice. So I think that helped him a lot. But I think he got into hypnosis in the first place because it was like a perfect marriage of two things he was very interested in, of being on stage, being in the spotlight, and also literally controlling people. I think that's what brought him to it in the first place. But when you watch tape of the shows, it's like, this guy is excellent. It would be a very fun show, I think, to go to a Dante show in his heyday in San Diego in the 80s or whatever. I think anyone would enjoy that show.
And I guess related to that, I guess I'd describe him as an anti-hero, right? That he's the protagonist of our story. I mean, I can only speak for myself as like both a listener, but also I worked on it. So you don't want to like him. And generally it's not a stretch to call him a bad person in some ways. And yet he's obviously charming and likable. There's like a real emotional arc. And in the end, I felt genuine like sorrow, sadness related to him and wanted to root for him in a way that I shouldn't have, I guess. Like how did you feel about him when you started and then when it ended?
Yeah, I think he was mostly probably a very terrible person, but I don't think he was a terrible person because he decided to be a terrible person. I think he had like diagnosable narcissism or megalomania, and he wasn't afraid to use people. And like I said, he was definitely a social climber. But the thing that really changed my opinion of him was the way that all the tape came about in the series was a documentary filmmaker, Bradley Beasley. He had been on the Dante beat for several years and had these interviews and footage of him when he was still alive. And the footage of his final live shows where I think he had cancer, he was in poor health. And after seeing footage of him in his heyday and then seeing footage of this final show was so devastatingly sad to see someone, whether he's a good person or not, he had this incredible talent and this incredible charm and a gift for being on stage, but he just could not make the show work. He couldn't stand on the chair. He was struggling vocally during the induction of the people to hypnotize them. And it's so vulnerable to watch that footage of him failing in the last show that, I don't know, after reading everything I did about him and him being this unapologetic, bulletproof man who could pivot from ploy to ploy his whole life and mostly have success and mostly make money at whatever he was trying, watching him fail at the very end was kind of hard to watch. And I don't know if it was hard to watch because I cared about him or I had an idea of how this public failure would make him feel based on how he had lived his life. And it's hard to watch anyone have this moment of shame and embarrassment on stage.
And credit to you and Bradley for giving the footage and Garrett, I think, for the music. That this is a unique podcast for us in the sense that the main character, who's heavily in all 8 episodes, was dead from the beginning, right? Which is usually a reason not to make a podcast, but because Bradley had this footage and you were able to bring him to life so well, both through writing and also through interviews you guys did. And then I think, especially in that last episode, like the arc takes you on a real emotional journey, which is unusual when you don't have access in audio, when you don't have access to the subject, because it's very hard to make a podcast when you can't talk to someone, and especially to have feelings about that person. But this show is like remarkably 3-dimensional and alive, and it's a very tender portrait of a con artist.
Yeah. When someone gives you a big mountain of tape and interviews and footage like that, and the assignment is to sort of make something, I wasn't sure what I wanted it to be. But then when I watched the footage and all the events leading up to the final show, I was so emotionally affected by it, and it snuck up on me. I'm like, I wonder if I can write this in such a way where I make other people who would be like, oh, this guy is reprehensible, if I can sneak up on them at the end and make them care about this mostly evil man going out with a whimper. And then he dies shortly after that performance. And how does that make you feel? Do you still feel like, oh, screw that guy? Because I was kind of surprised that I didn't feel that way.
I didn't either.
By the end of it.
Yeah, you guys pulled it off very well. Must have been very different than Wild Boys was so personal for you in that it was your backyard and you kind of lived it. This one you had absolutely no knowledge of, relationship to the subject. So how was it different writing a series where you went into it like, I don't even know who this person is?
Yeah, it was very different, but it was the same team, and that made me feel good that I had Abukar as my producer and Karen Duffin was my story editor and Garrett. And making Wild Boys, I literally had no idea what I was doing. I had to learn how to structure a story like this and how to use all of the tools required to make a podcast and how to get the interviews and everything. So it was very nice to go right into Dante and have the same team and a clear idea knowing what I was doing. And it's such a different story than Wild Boys. It's such a different character at the center, and like you said, it was less personal. So I remember really bathing in this mountain of tape and interviews with Bradley before we started outlining it, because how to structure it wasn't obvious in the same way that Wild Boys was obvious to me, because I'm like, I remember my town lived through this thing and then no one followed up with those guys to figure out what was really happening. So the outline to that and structure was obvious to me. Whereas with Dante, I'm like, I have no idea how to do this. But then when I saw at every point in his life, he's talking about Lana Turner. He's talking about like, I once dated Lana Turner. He was telling people that in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. And I'm like, I think that is where this all starts. I can't tell this story without beginning with the Lana Turner, which was a challenge because Lana Turner is long since passed, and we didn't have a ton of tape from that time. So it was a big challenge to write the first episode because I had to rely so much on all of the celebrity tabloids that talked about their relationship. Lana Turner's biographies, both the one that she wrote and unauthorized ones. And the best source for that first episode was actually her intern. She had like an intern assistant who was present for the whole Dante relationship. And I originally wrote the first 2 episodes of Dante to be about him and Lana Turner's relationship. But then I'm like, what are we doing? There's too much to get through. We have to get through like the diploma farms, the permanent makeup, the hypnosis seminars, and prison time, him working at Knott's Berry Farm. We have too much to get through to dwell too much on this. He had so many schemes that's like maybe every episode needs to be the new scheme.
I don't want to spoil too much for people who might listen to this and haven't listened to the series, but I'll never forget Dante making Lana Turner celibate is one of my favorite. He ruined men for her.
I know. And in her book, she's someone who's like, oh, whenever I saw a handsome new guy in Hollywood, I would hook up with him. And she's like, I loved men, and the more the merrier. But Dante is the one at the end of it all that she's like, I'm done with men. Never again will there be a man. And there wasn't, as far as the research led me to believe. I think she was literally done after that man. Oh, God.
I mean,
what a legacy.
What a legacy. I mean, this should be on his tombstone, I guess. I don't know. Both something to be proud of and horrified by. Well, you mentioned, and I think it is one of those characters where he lived so many lives. And I think even within those lives, there's so much that happened. I think I remember meetings with us and Karen where she's like trying to explain to you that we can't use it all. Because it's one of those stories where you're cutting things that are legitimately amazing, right? Where you're like, no, that should be 10 minutes. And she's like, if that's 10 minutes, this is going to be 400 hours of podcast, right?
I know. I've come to learn that it's a good sign when you're cutting things that you love.
Yeah.
But yeah, and there were so many little segues, stories of shootouts where he would get into it with the mob, and this whole thing with Frank Sinatra. If you ask Dante, he's like, oh, me and Frank, we have bad blood, but I am almost positive that Frank Sinatra had no idea who he was and never knew. I think
he dated Nancy, didn't he? Or he claimed to?
He claimed to. We actually got a response from Nancy Sinatra. I said, I think, I've read that you were romantically involved with him at some point. And she didn't confirm or deny, but she wished us all the best. He made up this story where he was dating Nancy Sinatra and Frank found out and he sent some heavies after him that shot a bunch of bullet holes through the motel room door. And we can't corroborate this with anyone or any old newspaper clippings. We have no evidence of this, but it is a thing that he told lots of people. I'm just remembering one of my favorite things about Dante is no matter where he was, he wanted everyone to think, wow, that guy's so cool. That guy's so impressive. And it's so funny that when he got out of prison the last time, he was living in this trailer park by the ocean just outside of San Diego. And all of the people there were obsessed with him. Everyone in this, it wasn't just a trailer park. There were people that were living in tents and stuff on it. And from what I understand, there was lots of drugs flowing through the place. But when Bradley was interviewing the folks at this sort of mobile park, everyone's like, oh, Dante's incredible. He was friends with Buddy Hackett. He was this and he was that. And even at the end of his life, in the context of the trailer park, which was his whole life, he needed to be a big deal in that park and at the sushi restaurant that he loved going to. It's when he walked into those two places, he was somebody still,
There's something charming about that too.
Totally.
I guess the last question would be, these series were very different, but I think one thing they had in common is that Wild Boys obviously took place halfway in the past and you shift perspective and it goes to the present and you find them. This isn't exactly that, but it actually, thanks to Bradley, it kind of had that, where you tell the story of Dante throughout this 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then it rips us into 20 whatever, and we're with Bradley. And I thought it worked really well. I didn't actually know you were going to do that in the series.
Yeah. And make the journalist kind of a character as well. I just loved the Bradley aspect of the story. I loved having him, he was almost the last man that he conned. And there's something so hilarious about that. And Bradley, he's such a fantastic character where he's no bullshit, but he was kind of buying what Dante was selling leading up to the final performance that we built the back end of the series around. I just loved his voice and I loved his framing and understanding of what makes Dante tick at the end. I really loved that.
And it's another little emotional mini emotional arc is that you get invested in Bradley's investment in this guy, and then Bradley gets his heart broken. I mean, Bradley's, I think, near tears at one point, right? Because he spent his own money on this, right?
He was in the financial hole, and he phoned in a bunch of favors to have a crew to shoot this thing, and he guilted a bunch of friends into coming to make up the audience of this final show, and it all fell apart at the last minute. And the tape of that sinking in for him, it's kind of a nightmare where everyone, you're like, personal relationships and your financial situation are all tied up in this big mess where you're relying on the least reliable man perhaps to ever walk the earth.
I know, and at home you're like, no, Bradley, no.
Totally.
It turns out, spoiler alert, it turns out okay for Bradley, and luckily all that footage was not for naught, and we made the series, and hopefully we're still working on a documentary adaptation that Bradley's initial vision will see the light of day. So, and I guess then you've got Go Boy, your next series, coming in early 2025 is the plan?
Yeah, that'll be the next Campside one. I imagine maybe the spring. Mm-hmm.
Give me the elevator pitch.
The elevator pitch of Go Boy, there's a French-Canadian guy who robbed 100 banks and broke out of maximum security prison 13 times in his life. And he spent his whole life trying to get out of prison, his whole adult life. But the thing that got him out of prison was he wrote a memoir while he was behind bars. And the memoir became such a big deal. It won the most prestigious literary award in Canada. He wrote about everything he suffered on the inside in prison. And it was such a success that Prime Minister Trudeau, senior from the 70s, that Prime Minister Trudeau, got the machinery to let him out, parole him ahead of time. So he finally got out of prison. He had fame, fortune, and then what does he do? He robs a bank.
There's some overlaps with Dante there, right? Couldn't quit.
Definitely. It's truly an addiction. Listening to the Go Boy guy talk about robbing banks, it's like he's talking about robbing banks as if he's trying to buy cocaine. But he wasn't a drug or alcohol guy at all. He was just addicted to the high of breaking out of prison, robbing banks, and then when he was on the outside, life was so boring that he had to get into skydiving and learn how to be a pilot. He just needed his adrenaline fix.
Sounds like it's
but it's an incredible story. Yeah.
All right. Well, sometime in 2025. All right, Sam. Thanks, man.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks again to Sam and the rest of the Dr. Dante team, and thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. Don't forget to head over to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.